Welcome to our chat tonight on financial aid appeals by Juno. My name's Leah Young, and I'm excited to speak with you tonight and tell you a little bit about what we know about this process. I personally come from a financial aid background. I'm the former assistant vice president for enrollment and director of financial aid at a small liberal arts college. Um, in Pennsylvania. And I have probably read well over 1,000 appeals at this point in my career. Recently joined Juno. I'm excited about what they're doing to help folks understand a little more clearly how to navigate this process and how to get some great resources along the way. I will be happy to take your questions at any time. Because I am managing this by myself this evening, would appreciate if you put any of those questions in the Q&A so that I can keep good track of those without scrolling. And we do welcome those questions. We'll let you know this is a very popular webinar. And if we don't get to all of your questions, we will absolutely follow up after the webinar, answering those and sending that to the whole list of registrants. We'll also be sending a copy of this presentation to everyone. So if you don't absorb it all the first time around, you'll get the recording, you'll get the slides, and you will also get the answers to all the questions in writing. All right, so with that out of the way, I will go ahead and get started. And we'll take off here. Just what we're going to cover first is the timeline for financial aid, merit-based appeals versus need-based appeals. You'll see we're going to spend a little longer on need-based appeals just because they tend to be more involved, and go over those reasons. We've also launched a brand new free tool in the last week or so that helps you write your appeal letter for you. You give it some prompts, and we will go ahead and show you how that works, how you can use it to your advantage. My favorite thing is it tells you exactly what kind of documentation you might want to provide to the financial aid office. And then we'll make sure we get to your questions. I already see a couple popping up in the Q&A. So I'm going to definitely get to that second question. Can you share other offers for merit with competing schools and programs? The short answer is yes. I'll give you more details in just a bit. And are there specific majors that tend to get more aid when appealing? That really depends and can vary from school to school. So that one is more of a school-specific question, and there's not good reportable data to where I could answer that with confidence. But my initial response would be probably, especially if a school is looking to fill a certain number of seats in said major or program, and they're concerned about meeting their goals for that. That's my suspicion, but again, schools don't report out on that data, so we don't have a good indication. All right, so let's jump in here to the slides. And we are just going to outline, the timeline for financial aid. Would love to see by raise of hands, if you can use the raise hand feature, how many folks are either students going into college next year or parents of students going into college next year? So you're applying this cycle. All right, I'm seeing a good amount of hands going up. I'm gonna have you put those hands down. And let's see how many folks are applying in a future cycle and you're trying to prepare ahead of time. All right, I don't see any hands for that. So I'll assume you all have gone through this early part of the cycle, have perhaps submitted your FAFSA, received the results of that for that student aid index, have applied. Maybe you've gotten some decisions and you are either sitting with your financial aid offer or you are likely to get it in the coming weeks or months. So this is once you have your financial aid offer, whatever timeline that particular school has set out with that, that's when you can take a look and see if an appeal is advisable. By May, you have to make that decision. Your student has to make that decision of where they're going to attend. And then come June, if you have not gotten all of the, grants and federal resources, you may have to research some additional student loan options, and tuition bills are typically due around August at most schools, some as early as July, especially if you want to do a payment plan. That catches some folks, first-time college parents, by surprise, that if you want to set up a payment plan, which is a great low-cost option for spreading those payments out, typically over 10 payments, you have to set that up by July in most cases, or do some catch-up payments. All right, so just want to highlight that we do have webinars available, recordings available on our website of our previous webinars. If you are earlier in this process, you want to take a look at that, you can go to our webinar site. I'm going to grab that right here and put it in the chat for you. And so if you want to check out some of our previous webinars that have been recorded, you can do that right there. And we'll talk through today's topic, and we'll have future webinars along the timeline that match up with that, particularly on the applying for student loans piece, if that is going to be applicable to you. All right, so let's assume you've received your award offer, your financial aid offer. Now what? Do encourage you to think of this as, an initial offer, first draft, if you will, versus a finished product. This is at many schools, not all schools. Particularly your best chances tend to be at schools that have a merit program, and or a need-based financial aid program. So less typically, sometimes it's harder or less likely to get an appeal, sometimes at a state school. Not going to say that broadly across the country, versus your private institutions. But you want to do your due diligence, and it doesn't hurt to ask, because you'll see this big note on the bottom of the screen. Schools won't rescind an acceptance just because you ask for help, so it's okay to try. You've already been admitted by the time you get your financial aid offer. So there is, it only hurts to not ask, because you're not going to get additional aid in the majority of cases if you don't ask for it. And this is especially true when you're targeting schools to ask for additional consideration. You really want to target those top schools where it's going to make an impact on your decision, because this can be a time-intensive process. And schools typically want to know that they are one of your children's or your top choices. All right. So the two types of financial aid appeals we'll be discussing is merit-based. That's based on achievement, GPA, test scores, other factors, trophies, achievements, etc. Generally speaking, awards that your student has received, versus need-based aid, where that is basically you're trying to report changes that have happened since the data you submitted was valid. We're going to go into more detail about why that is pretty prevalent over the course of these negotiations, because of how the FAFSA and CSS profile collects data. We do have this note, both may apply. There may be a reason to submit more information in both, so you're not limited to one or the other. So some tips for asking for more merit aid. Again, you want to make sure you really want that program and you know why. It does usually help, going back to this question, that can you share other offers for merit with competing schools' program? It usually does help, because you can credibly tell one school that you'd choose it if you had more aid, and sometimes they'll ask you to prove it. So be prepared to submit that competing offer upon request. It typically helps if it is a school that is of similar status, for lack of a better word. I did both the enrollment on the undergraduate level and the law school level, and did some more admissions there and more merit-based negotiations on the law area. So I'm going to use that as an example. Also, it keeps me from naming any names on the undergrad level. So in that case, it was like you couldn't necessarily pit an offer from a, you know, bottom tier law school that had a low bar passage rate and low employment rate versus a school that had really strong outcomes, you know, as much as ranking is a flawed system that had, you know, a significantly higher rank, they wouldn't be considered comparable offers. So you want to keep that in mind when you're evaluating the strength of your merit offer. Is it a comparable school and program? And again, they're not going to change their mind on that. So we want to make sure you're structuring that negotiation in the best way possible. I always appreciated making sure that when I was reviewing merit appeals, that the student was really doing their due diligence, that they had researched why this school was their first or second or third choice. I will say, don't necessarily tell them that they're second or third choice. You know, the schools don't necessarily need to have that information, but a top choice. And so expressing the enthusiasm for that school, mentioning specific programs or faculty or something special. The school I worked for had this amazing farm, organic farm, that really attracted some students to the school that wanted to not have to go to a large agricultural public institution, but have that small liberal arts piece with the added farm. So that would sometimes be the specific piece that people cited. And we could tell if it was very rote or put together in a formulaic way. And so, you know, you want to aim for that authenticity, aim for what's really drawing there. I see a Q&A question here. Should the child write this or the parent? For the merit appeal, I always preferred this coming from the student versus the parent. And in fact, one of the schools I worked with absolutely required that it came from the student themselves, not the parent. So the student should write it specifically for the merit appeal. The need-based situation, it could be the parent's financial situation, and they might not want to disclose that to the student in full detail. And it's more sensitive information. So that side is perfectly okay to come from a parent. But the merit appeal, you want the student to express their own enthusiasm, to express their own achievements. What has changed since admission? That's a big one. So if something has already been covered in the admissions application, it's not necessarily helpful to bring it up again that in the appeal letter. But if there's been like, hey, grades have come out since I applied and I aced my AP course in the fall, and I was selected for the National Honor Society or a special award, you definitely want to include those. And also when you're citing competing offers saying, you know, this school offered me X amount more, but I would really strongly prefer to go to your institution. But it's hard to justify that price because of the difference times, you know, 4 years, 4 or 5 years, depending on how long the program length is, and just need a little bit more help to be able to make this work from a financial perspective. You do want to be polite in that request. Schools typically don't like to feel like they are being treated like Flow, the price match tool. They want to know that it's a personal and strong preference for your student. Got a question in the chat. Who should write it if you want to appeal both merit and need. And, it's going to depend on the school and what their processes are. But, in the case of the institution where I worked at, we would want the merit portion written by the student and the need portion submitted by, whatever made sense in the situation. So, use your best judgment, reach out to the school and ask. We use the term negotiation here in this presentation. So 2 letters, it could be 2 letters. Again, you want to check with the school to see if it's a separate process or if they can review that as one process. Because in some schools, they have a committee. Where I worked, we had a committee made up of both admissions and financial aid so that we could look at it as a holistic process, right? Like, hey, maybe we can't do more merit, but there's room to consider this other detail in need, or maybe a person submitted merit, but what they describe as actual need. So we're gonna follow up and get some more information. And I think that model works really well, but some schools may do it completely separate. So admissions may decide merit and financial aid might decide need. It could be a committee decision. So it's always good to ask the school what their best process and best recommendation is. I was saying that we use the word negotiation here. It definitely ties into what people equate for what they want to do here. Schools much prefer if you use the term reconsideration. Again, going back to that price match tool, it's just a little bit different framing of, hey, things have changed. I have different offers. I have different things that I've achieved. Can I submit things so that you can reconsider my aid and see if there's additional help that I can get? All right. I'm seeing some questions going through. I might have to pause these and come back to them just because we're cooking with these. I would start with the financial aid office. So the question is, you don't just send requests to the financial aid office. There's the different department we should look up on the school website. I would start with the financial aid office and they'll point you in the right direction because both merit and need are technically forms of financial aid, even if the admissions office is going to decide on the merit-based aid. But they'll let you know and they'll point you in the right direction. I am going to get to the SAI question in the next cycle. But the short answer is yes, that is worth trying for an appeal. But I'll go into more detail in just a bit. Yeah, and then what's it a reasonable merit amount to challenge? And I'm going to answer that probably at the end because that's a nuanced question. And I want to make sure we get through some more of the content, and you can always schedule a call with me. Those are free as well. Everything we do here is free. If we need to discuss that in a little bit more of a nuanced situation. All right. So I will point out, I'm not a big fan of just reading slides, but you do want to avoid exaggerating those competing offers because you might be requested to provide those as proof. All right, you want to submit these after receiving multiple offers, but before the enrollment deadline. And so you want to have that case, especially if your challenge is based on competing offers. And you want to give the offices time to review that because they may or may not be able to extend your deposit deadline. And some schools won't wait for you if you're waiting to hear back from another school. And that's a harder ask actually than the appeal. So I would, if at all possible, allow yourself at least 30 days before the deadline for enrollment to submit those appeals. So, by the end of March, April, sometimes that timeline isn't going to work out based on when you hear from the school, but you want to review those quickly, assess whether it is workable for your family to attend that institution, assess whether there's any changed information on which to base an appeal, or you're having trouble deciding because of a competing offer, and then go ahead and go through that process. So as we said, financial aid and/or admissions offices are typically the ones involved in this. And one of three answers: essentially approved, you get what you ask for. Counter offers, sometimes they'll say, well, maybe we don't have the budget or the inclination to meet everything that was requested, but what we can do is, let's say you requested $10,000 extra, maybe we can do 6,000. And then sometimes it's a flat out denial. And in that case, it's a good opportunity to ask, hey, what are the options for next year? Is there a reevaluation process every year? Is there merit aid for folks who perform really well in their first year? Is there merit aid available in that second year? I'm anticipating a big income change in the second year. What are the processes then? And so while they probably can't give you a definitive answer, at least you know what can or cannot happen in that case. All right. Can I appeal even if I received a zero merit offer? Absolutely. So absolutely you can. And again, having other institutions that have offered aid where the cost of attendance is ultimately lower, that's a key piece that I may suggest we add a slide for here. When you're asking them to reconsider, I can't tell you how many times. Here's my just like quick break for some hacks. I can't tell you how many times I had folks say, well, X school gave me $5,000 more than your school, but X school cost $10,000 more than the school where I was employed at. So that means that our total costs were $5,000 less than X school. So make sure you're doing the math on the total cost of attendance minus that gift aid, the merit or need-based aid, to see what your true costs are. And it's not just a flat dollar amount of one school giving you more than another. All right. I also would really recommend, especially if your student is submitting a merit appeal, that you help them proofread it. I have often seen the wrong school being cited as where they are really excited to go to for, when they're a very general letter without citing program specifics. So that's another quick tip for you as well. Again, don't be shy about appealing. If you're not appealing, somebody else will. Everybody has the right for reconsideration. Okay, so let's move on to the need-based aid side. This becomes prevalent so often because it's based on a snapshot. It's based off of prior year data. So if you've already filled out your FAFSA, you probably know that is based on 2024 tax data. A lot can change in those intervening 2 years between when your tax year was and when you're starting an institution. So it might not capture that full data, and it might, so there might be changes, but also the FAFSA itself does not provide the ability to give extenuating circumstances. If you're, by raise of hands, anyone applying to schools that require the CSS profile, just curious, seeing, quite a few hands going up. So I know that can feel very onerous to complete. It is incredibly detailed. It doesn't have that IRS tool that brings over your data like the FAFSA does. But one thing I do really like about it is it has a free form box where you can put in your extenuating circumstances. And when I was running a financial aid office, we would always try to reach out proactively when we saw that there was an extenuating circumstance so that we could ask for those documents to address it proactively rather than on appeal. So if you're only applying to FAFSA schools, there is a higher likelihood that the school doesn't know your full financial picture versus the CSS profile. So let's talk just quickly about how need is calculated. If you've attended our SAI workshop, we go into this very in detail, but it's as to how the SAI is the student aid index is calculated. But need is essentially the school's cost of attendance. So that's going to be different at every institution. It includes the full cost, not just the tuition, but living expenses, room, meals, etc., if that's included in your student's experience, minus that result from the FAFSA equals your financial need. So that's why if your SAI, we have the question is falsely inflated due to some like one-time issues or some funds you can't access, that's where you really want to appeal, because that is eating into your determined financial need. A lot of the schools that use the CSS profile have pretty strong financial need-based programs. They might even meet full demonstrated need, so that can make a big impact. It's pretty basic as to what it includes. It includes income data, which is the heaviest consideration to your SAI. So if your income has changed, that very much can impact your financial need. Your assets and your family size. So if any of those three have substantively changed since you filled out your financial aid forms, that is impacting your student aid income, or student aid index rather. And again, we mentioned that that's from 2 years ago. If your income, if you've had a job loss, job change to a much lower income, that's a good reason to appeal. Assets are a little bit trickier because they are supposed to be reported as of the day you file those forms. So in some, we mentioned in our other webinars on filing the FAFSA, the SAI webinar, that you may want to plan, like, let's say you were setting aside money for a down payment for a house or a car. You may want to time that so that you're, if possible, I know life doesn't always work out that way, that you want to time that so that that is coming out of your accounts before filing the FAFSA or CSS profile. You may have more expenses that it's not accounting for, like medical expenses. I've seen a lot of appeals focused on, hey, a sibling has a disability and some medical expenses that, are pretty substantial. So can the financial aid office take a look at all of those? That is something that they can potentially look at in an appeal. And so if your family size has changed, that's also going to have a strong account, because a strong, potentially strong change to your student aid income because of something called an income protection allowance. And that shifts with how many people are in your family. Here are just some quick reasons for appeal. I don't want you to get too in the weeds. I'm certainly not going to read this chart verbatim to you. Again, you'll get the copies of the slides. I'm going to put this up and take a look at the questions, and then we'll hit some high points. Yeah. Okay. I have noticed such a huge discrepancy between CSS profile school offers and schools that just ask for the FAFSA. How can I use that full financial picture that the CSS profile school offers in an appeal for a school that did not ask for that? Can I use that? I'm going to see if you can add some clarifying information there. Are those schools, so often what the difference is that the CSS profile schools typically allocate more resources towards need, and they, because of that, and often may even state that they meet full demonstrated need, where schools that don't collect it might not be able to meet full demonstrated need. So that's why you're seeing lower aid offers. and it's just that they don't meet that full need. But you can certainly take that as a competing offer and saying, so and so assessed my need as X. Here are some extenuating circumstances. That was the reason for that in the information they received, and then outline that and request they relook at that. So that's how I would frame it in that case. Hopefully that gives you some context as to why you're seeing that pattern. Because while schools that ask for the CSSF profile often offer more need, at the same time, they may be, you know, need aware, so that can affect admissions. They might be need blind and it doesn't matter at all. So I might have gone down on a tangent there on that particular piece, but there's a reason they ask for more data, because they're trying to really truly see what the need of the family is. The FAFSA is an imperfect tool, as you're probably experiencing, because it doesn't collect a whole lot of information. It doesn't ask you how many students are in college. It doesn't take that into account. Actually, I think it does still ask, but it doesn't take that into account. Schools have the option to take that into account. Schools have a lot of options they can opt into or out of on the CSS profile. If that's not helpful information, let me know, but essentially I would use it more as competing offers and provide some additional context to your FAFSA data, and offer to provide documentation as requested. All right. Is pending retirement grounds for appeal? Usually it's a fairly weak case until it actually happens. So pending employment grounds, again, it could differ from school to school, but weaker once after retirement, that can qualify for additional reconsideration, because that is a pretty substantial income change. So you can provide updated income and, you know, like where you're receiving your retirement income from. But certainly a pretty common concern I've seen in my time. All right, so yeah, that income reduction is a very frequent example. Providing pay stubs or letters from employers can be helpful. Obviously, job loss is a change to income, but resigning voluntarily may not count. One-time income is a big piece. Sometimes you want to make sure your rollover, if you rolled over an IRA, that's not being pulled in incorrectly, and just make sure that gets removed from consideration. And reduction in child support can be a cause for an appeal as well. Don't worry, the tool that I'm going to highlight really pulls in all of this information for you. So when you check off what is affecting your appeal, it will walk you through the recommended documents to submit. So unexpected medical expenses, ongoing medical treatment, all of this is pretty typical, and stronger reasons for an appeal. Caring for an elderly or sick family member might be able to, especially if they're now living with the family and maybe weren't before, that can change the family size. Or a significant, high fixed expenses, though typically things like credit card debt does not count, but student loan repayment for the parent, not another student, can sometimes be considered. That was something we would consider with proof of that monthly payment, court-ordered obligations, etc. All right. Sibling or parent enrolled in college, but the FAFSA doesn't consider that. Some schools may on a case-by-case basis. Other schools will include it in the CSS profile calculations. Obviously, if there's been a death of a parent since that 2024 income, that's pretty substantial. And divorce or separation after submitting the FAFSA, that can get pretty complicated. And the school will essentially have to update your FAFSA, pulling apart that tax return and trying to identify which is coming from which parent. There's a couple of ways through federal regulations that I won't bore you with that they can determine that. But all of those are good reasons for a need-based appeal. You want to initiate that. Again, typically pretty clear on the need-based process. You want to start with the financial aid office. They have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, but they are required to look at that. They are required to, through new legislation, which I think is on the next slide. They have the authority. That's been in higher education regulations for a long time, through professional judgment, to adjust the cost of attendance. They can, even on the FAFSA, they can update that with your 2025 tax returns. If you've had a major update in income that's captured in 2025, probably a strong reason to do your 2025 tax returns as soon as possible so that you can submit those to be used as a basis for your FAFSA data and potentially your CSS profile data instead of 2024. They typically will notify you, provide a new financial aid offer from what they've been able to review and offer. Sometimes if there's been further changes or if you didn't include something, they'll look again. But you want to make sure some have a one and done policy, so you want to make sure you know that before you submit. You'll need to, once again, do a formal appeal letter. So state the reason for your appeal, explain the circumstances that were not reflected in your original application. You want to provide supporting data and particularly those financial documents. That's going to back up why you're asking for that appeal. I mentioned this, but the new FAFSA Simplification Act requires schools to allow students to appeal, and they have to consider all appeals and requests for adjustment. Schools must publicly disclose the option and process appeals on their website, but there's no guarantee that they have to grant the additional aid, but they must consider it. But anything outside of the standard considerations is determined on a case-by-case basis by the financial aid office. Here are some things that sometimes people ask about that are not available, that do not impact those appeal changes. So reduction in 401k values. In fact, on the FAFSA, the 401k data isn't even a part of your student aid index, but some CSS profile schools will use that as a calculation, particularly if folks have significantly more of a 401k savings than is typical for their age, or recommended. I shouldn't say typical. I know a lot of folks struggle to hit the recommended retirement pieces. Reduction in investment values. Again, you're required to report it as of the date the FAFSA was submitted. This is a really challenging one for students whose parents refuse to contribute to the student's education. That is unfortunately not part of what can be considered for a financial aid appeal as far as adjustments to the FAFSA. Particularly because that's a federal regulation, what determines a student's dependency status versus independent. Now, if a student has been abandoned by parents, is deemed to be independent because of extenuating circumstances, that's very challenging to prove. And so I'm not encouraging you to abandon your children so they'll get financial aid, in other words. Essentially, that's not going to bolster the case for an appeal. Unwillingness or inability to borrow Parent Plus loans or lack of credit-worthy cosigners are also not typically appeal reasons that get approved. I've been mentioning this a few times, so I'm going to drop this in the chat too. We have this new appeal letter generator that essentially you put in some details about, and none of this information is saved. We do not retain this information. There is no privacy concerns there. So I'm popping that in the chat, and I am just seeing a question there. I'll address that in a moment. But this, again, some basic inputs about what's going on. It'll help you craft the letter that you can edit. And then you can, it'll recommend the additional documentation to, again, make sure that it's a good case and go from there. So let me preview this for you. And let me read this question in the chat. Applied and paid deposit for top and only school, and parents have had a major setback in real estate investment that should have positively influenced cash flow for tuition. Would it be advantageous for both of us to appeal, and what might be our best strategy? So I would say that would be a need-based appeal. And I would focus on the fact that your cash flow has been impacted versus the real estate investment value. And because, again, investments are typically, snapshotted as of the date. So focus on what income generation has changed versus what was expected. So that's how I would approach that. And this tool works both for entering students and continuing students. You can choose what type of appeal you are choosing, and you can choose multiple options. This also does address that dependency override request where I mentioned that can be difficult to prove, but this tool will help as well with that. You'll enter in the competing details of your financial aid offers. The tool will evaluate where your strongest competitive positioning is. For the need-based appeals, you'll select all the reasons that apply. You'll put in some quick inputs, and it'll generate your appeal letter and recommend the supporting evidence. Especially for folks who don't know where to even start, this is a great tool to just get some ideas. I mean, I think it works. When they first told me that they were working on this, I have to tell you, as a former financial aid administrator, I kind of internally groaned because I was assuming it was going to be more like a template. And I tested the outputs expecting to kind of hate it, because while I'm all for families, asking for reconsideration, being helped through the process. I was concerned about the quality because I've seen some bad tools out there that, it's clear it's not very thoughtful, but I was actually impressed and had to rescind my skepticism. So I do encourage you to try it out. Again, it's a free tool that we're offering to folks that come to our webinars and go to our websites. Feel free to share it with anyone that needs it. And we hope that it's helpful for you. Do want to just quickly recap in case you haven't heard. There are some changes coming to federal student aid that affect undergrads. The biggest changes are going with grad students, but if you, which most of you are by raise of hands, if a student enrolled before July 1st, 2026, and borrowed, there's no changes. But if you have a student who's enrolling for the first time after July 1st, 2026, there is a new cap on federal Parent Plus loans. You used to be able to borrow as much as you needed up to that school's cost of attendance. And now you only can borrow up to $20,000 a year and up to a total of $65,000 over 4 years. Now you can divide that up how you want, up to that $20,000 max and $65,000 max. But if you need to borrow all $20,000 of that the first 3 years, you'll only have $5,000 left in the final year. All right, so I'm gonna go to the questions here. Does the tool know what appeal is called at specific schools? I am not sure the answer to that. I would think, I know that it does use some AI, so it probably depends where that's pulling from, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. I will try to get the answer to you and ensure we have that for you in the response. All right. Is there a cap to how much private loan could be? There is. It's the cost of attendance. A lot of folks are under the misconception that private loans, you can borrow as much as you want. It has to be within the school's cost of attendance less any other aid that you're given. So if we use that $20,000 cost of attendance that we used earlier, and let's say you received $10,000, your student received $10,000 in grant aid, and you didn't, I prefer, particularly if a student is eligible for subsidized loans, those don't accrue interest during school or during the 6-month grace period. But every now and then I hear parents say that they don't want any of the student loans in their student's name. Keep in mind, this can help them, if they go on to graduate school, establish credit, where they're not going to have the option of the Graduate Plus loan anymore. So there are some arguments to be made for having those in your student's loan. And again, the subsidized loan, no interest accruing while in school, or rather the government pays the interest while they're in school. The cap is the cost of attendance minus any other aid. So if you borrow the $3,500 in the subsidized loan, $3,500, that will reduce that $10,000 to $6,500 would be your remaining private loan eligibility if you didn't have any other aid. So that's how that calculation works for private student loans. Unfortunately, being capped by new loan limits is not grounds for an appeal. All right. So great, somebody can borrow as much as they need. If it came to that, would you need a credit history in order to get those loans? Yes and no. So most high school going into college age students do not have the credit history to qualify for private loans on their own, unless maybe you've started them earlier as a authorized user and then gotten them their own credit card. Most private loan lenders want to see that they've been able to manage credit on their own for a little while. So most of the time, students need a cosigner if they are going to qualify for the loans in their names, right? I see both sides of the spectrum. I see parents who don't want who want all the loans in the student's name, and parents who don't want any loans in the student's name, for various perfectly reasonable explanations. So yes, but you're likely going to have to co-sign a student loan. So if you're concerned about being on the hook for that, I would look at things like co-signer release options and read the fine print on those. Look at the provisions for death and total disability on those loans, because that's a feature the federal loans have that the private loans typically, I won't say typically, some lenders do offer the death and disability clause, but that is something to look at in the fine print of both types of products. All right. So Juno is really another option to try and help you have more options. It's probably not awkward phrasing. We do group negotiations. We try and leverage those groups to drive down the cost of private student loans and to get folks more access to better private loans. So we've been doing this for the last 7 years. It was co-founded by two students at Harvard Business School who didn't like the rates they were getting and thought, hey, there's got to be a way to negotiate better rates. So they turned that into Juno, and essentially we're trying to get our negotiation groups as large as possible. It is, like everything else, free to join. There is no obligation to take a loan with us, but basically what we're asking is, if there's any chance you'll need a loan for this fall, we recommend you join our group by April 30th. You get access to lots of free resources, one-on-one conversations, excellent customer service that will answer your financial aid questions. And so we'd love for you to sign up. I'll give you that link in just a minute. We run a bid. We have conversations all year with lenders, but we run a final bid, asking them to compete for your business and to offer our members better rates than they may be able to get outside of Juneau. We share those with you. You can do a soft credit check to see if it meets your needs. If it does, great. If not, and you find something else elsewhere, hopefully you enjoyed the resources that we provided, and you'll maybe check back in future years to see if we're able to beat the market again. But really, the larger our group is, the more negotiation power we have. So we promise you that it will never cost you any money to sign up. There's no credit check for signing up, and or actually until you decide to take a loan with us. Even the credit check or the rate check when we do release our deals is a soft credit check. It does not obligate you to take a loan in any way. And again, you get that free support via one-on-one calls. So you sign up at joinjuneau.com. I'll pop that in there. And I'm just now seeing, apologies to those who popped the questions in the chat, that I will get to here in just a moment for the Q&A, because I was focusing on the Q&A versus the chat. All right. Think of it as a free option that gives you the access to the lowest rates we can negotiate. If you have any questions about what I've covered this evening or about Juneau, would love to hear them. Gonna hop to the chat. Do you recommend we take out a home equity loan instead of a parent or private loan? That is such a personal choice. And I'm not able to, nor would I want to, give you a specific recommendation. But here are some pros and cons. Taking out a home equity loan is essentially putting your home potentially at risk. And whereas a parent or private loan, they can't repossess your education or your students' education. But sometimes those home equity loans are fairly attractive rates. But there's not typically, deferments for hardship for those payments like there are on some of the student loan products. Additionally, you typically have to start paying back right away, versus with the student loan products, you can choose whether to defer those until after graduation versus paying them when in school. So those are some things to consider. Again, the death or total disability benefits are things to look at with the private and federal loans versus the home equity. And, if you wanted to we have a private loan calculator versus plus loan. If you do know your home equity rates, you could use that as a comparison tool between two loans to see, what the cost differential is over time and weigh that risk versus reward. So that's a tool. I'm going to also drop in the chat our resources page for undergraduate students so that you have quick access to that. Okay. What if spouse is still paying private student loans and also did a withdrawal from a 401k to pay for private high school, which made it look like we increased the household income? What kind of appeal can be done here? That's absolutely a need-based appeal. And each school might have a different way of approaching how they're going to do that. But what they could do is take the private student loan payments and use that to reduce your household income. I've seen that scenario multiple times before, as well as discounting the 401k withdrawal, at least to a certain extent, out of income for offsetting the tuition. Sometimes they're not able or willing to do that on a dollar for dollar basis, but I've certainly seen that being addressed in a need-based appeal and being reviewed and being able to up that offer a bit accordingly. If students attend the summer program before fall, does it grandfather you into the unlimited loans? Great question. So the rules are is it has to be part of the program. It has to start before July 1st, 2026. So you'll want to check with the school as if it if it's part of their curriculum slash program and not just like an add-on. But technically, it could be a potential way to qualify for that. It has to be, so here are some of the rules for the legacy clause that allow you to still be eligible. It has to be at the same institution under the same program. And when I say program, I mean talking about like a bachelor's degree. So if you're taking the courses at a community college to get a couple extra credits and then switching to a 4-year college, that's not going to do it because it can't be at a different institution. But if it's at the same institution, counts towards their degree, it's possible. And you want to check in with the school on specifics for that. All right. Any other questions? We still have a couple minutes here. Otherwise, I did leave a couple up here that I said I would, the nuanced question that I would get to. And I see a couple more popped up here. So as far as a trust fund that can't be accessed, that's absolutely, you want to outline the rules of that for appeal reasons. If it can be accessed, they might consider it to some extent in the future, but that's going to, again, be on a case-by-case basis. I think it's worth asking the question. What if you anticipate needing to buy a student a car to attend the school? Can you put that into a need-based appeal? That's typically not going to be a very strong case. It will bring down your income or your assets for the following year, but typically parent assets really only account for, they really only account for like something like 7 to 9% of what you're pulling out from there. So it might reduce your next year's aid, or it might increase your demonstrated need the next year, but it's not typically something student aid offices are going to jump to consider for additional aid. Is there a possibility students would not be able to get a private loan? Absolutely. If they don't have a cosigner, it's going to be unlikely. Or if they don't have a credit-worthy cosigner, because they're going to look at both income and income and credit history, credit score with their cosigner. So that can be an access challenge. And essentially credit education is so important for this piece. So if you know about credit, definitely take the time to educate your student. If you don't, seek out some great resources out there. Pull your credit report at annualcreditreport.com. You can do that up to once a week to monitor your credit. I can recommend some resources if you'd want to email it me at Leah, Leah, at joinjuno.com. But that's going to be the biggest pain point for families in this new era of not having the PLUS loan, which does have a credit check, but it looks for the significant absence of some major credit issues versus your actual credit score. If the school you want to ask more merit from is the one that gave you the most, is it worth it to ask for more? If you truly need it, and you can articulate why it would make a difference, then particularly if it's a potential barrier to entry, then yes. Otherwise, it might not be the best use of your time. Great question. We have several credit cards that we do not use but are open. Should we close those prior to applying for financial aid or potential loans? Absolutely not. I hate to say absolutely not for almost any question, but that is pretty clearly not in your best interest for your credit score. So that is a common misconception. So I'm glad you asked, but a common misconception, credit history is a big piece. So keeping your older credit cards open as long as possible helps. That's about 15% of your score. And then it also helps your utilization rate, which is how much of your credit you're using versus how much is available. So it's helping on both of those ends typically. So you want to keep your credit cards open, particularly if they're older credit cards. And again, if you're looking to keep your utilization rate low, that available option is helpful. Keep in mind if you don't use it for too long, sometimes they automatically close it. So you might want to put like a pack of gum on there once a month, or like a Netflix subscription on there once a month, something that's small and not impactful, but will keep it open. All right, I see we're coming up on 9 p.m. So I'm just going to try and answer this last question that came up that's in the Q&A. What is a reasonable merit amount to challenge? My daughter is getting 40 to 45%, which I thought was great. Income has changed, just trying to see if I should appeal both or not be greedy. I don't think it's greedy to try and get the best for your resources, but typically, if your need-based aid has changed and it's significant, that's what I would focus on, but also you could mention the accomplishments that changed, so that if they can look at both to see which one they're better able to potentially hit, or if it's a combination of both. All right, so feel free to hop off if you are done, but that last question, what about dual enrollment credit? If accepted and enrolled and credits are transferred in prior to 7-1, would that count as prior? Unfortunately not. You have to be taking classes at the institution where you're going to be enrolled for the next bit in order for that to count towards that legacy provision to allow you to borrow up to the cost of attendance and Graduate Plus loans. Thanks for the kind words coming through to host and panelists that this was helpful. I'm so glad to hear that. Please continue to check out our webinars and use our resources. We are so pleased to offer them to you. And I can be reached at leah@joinjuno.com. And you can also schedule appointments with us through our website. All right, have a great night, everyone. Take care.